competitiveness between Spain and Germany, say. Right? It's like it's the same country for monetary reasons. Showing the thing about multipliers, as I said earlier, where we have in fact the fiscal policy. Change the structural deficit, and GDP growth. A minus means an increased structural deficit, obviously. See, larger GDP growth rates in countries that went into a spending spree. You have lower GDP growth rates that basically adopted austerity. States that adopted austerity. And this is what it looks like in individual cases. Like I said, we can show that there are CME and LME, coordinated market economies, and liberal market economies in the preferences of reacting to a crisis, and this principally extends to fiscal policy in these days. And here you can see LME averages. Remember, blue line is real GDP growth. So when real GDP growth goes south, you have fewer revenues, you remember? Even if you want to keep the level of spending that you had before. So you're not going into this active fiscal policy, not necessarily. You just want to keep the state running all of the projects that it used to run. You have to go into that. You have to increase your deficit. And you here see a direct mirroring of the first curve by the second curve. You see structural balances decreasing, the deficits are increasing at almost the same rate as the GDP is falling. And this is what happened in these ostensibly neoliberal favoring countries. This is, again, I remind you, United Kingdom, Canada, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and the US averages in the first place. And the lower one is European CME averages. So you see a sharp drop in GDP and a very, very slow, compared to the first graph, reaction in structural balances. So you see a much slower natural reaction. This is before we had these strict regulations on fiscal policies in the EU. This is where you see, I would argue, a more or less natural reaction of fiscal policy stemming from national institutional regulation complementarities. It's much, much slower. And now take a look at what happens after we get all of these nice excessive deficit procedures and so on that actually work. You see a stagnating GDP growth rate. Well, it's fine. As an average, it's fine, but you have a reaction of slashing the deficits. And you'll see on national graphs that this can be quite drastic. So here you have the German reaction. Like I said, huge spike, huge fall in the real GDP growth, almost no reaction on the structural balance, a slight reaction, and then a sharp contraction. And this is, of course, the functioning new regulation. And this slashing of deficits now comes in the context of a new slowdown in GDP growth. And in Austria, you see something similar, although a more relaxed attitude to deficits. In Croatia, you see something similar. In Romania, you see quite relaxed attitude before 2004. Sorry, these are obviously wrong years. This is 2009. So you see before 2008, a relaxed attitude, and then a slashing of deficits despite this fall in GDP. You see Belgium is something actually approaching the LME, although obviously it's a CME. Now Poland is interesting. Poland, you remember there was a devaluation against Europe. So there was a swift response in Poland to the crisis. And of course, Poland, something is wrong with these graphs, sorry. Obviously. I'll just describe to you what happened. In Poland, you had, this was the only country basically that didn't have a reduction in GDP in 2009. And in part, this was because the structural balance did the same thing that happened in the LME graphs. So you had an active fiscal policy in response, or at least an attempt to keep the same levels. But then, after 2010, you see a falling curve for GDP growth and a slashing of deficits as a response. And this is basically what happens. This is basically what happens with what Europe became now. This is what happens when you have the functioning regulation on how your fiscal policy should look. Okay, here you see the United Kingdom and the United States, showing the point perfectly. I won't bother you with this anymore. So you have to understand, varieties of capitalism has a huge problem in discerning ideal types, basically functionalist perspectives on what these different regulations do, with descriptions of countries, and in turn with groupations of countries, country groups. You have sort of a blurred line. So what I try to show you here is explain first what the ideal types predict, and then show you what really happened in the labor market, what happened to the market capitalization, and now what happened to fiscal policy with an addendum of exchange rate regimes. And now the question is, how do we integrate, if we can see, and I claim that I can see, and I have some of analysis that they didn't really want to bother you with. I can see that these graphs killed you basically anyways. But take my word for it, you can see patterns in fiscal policy. In 2009, mind you, not in the past 3 years, or at least not so much. And if you take this into account, we have an ideal type of coping with the crisis. In LME, flexible labor markets mean, remember, sharp increases of unemployment. Sharp increases of unemployment, of course, mean a reduced GDP. And also we have hysteretic effects. Because if someone is unemployed for a long time, doesn't accumulate new knowledge, he will be more unemployable in the future. And when he is employed, again, you have statistical correlations with this, he will accept a smaller wage for the rest of his working life. So you have long-term effects of short-term unemployment. So in LMEs, remember, sharply growing unemployment means a slowdown in GDP, but discretionary fiscal policy means a correction of this, means a more anti-cyclical approach. So, sort of improving the GDP condition. And in CMEs, you have protected labor markets. Unemployment grows more slowly, which helps the GDP. But a pro-cyclical fiscal policy reduces it to sort of a complementary to institutional elements, helping them along to what you saw in one of the first graphs. Sorry. There. Helping them along to the edges of this graph. So what happens when you have all of these initiatives? Reducing your ability to react to a crisis. As I say, you have a single market, okay, we won't raise tariffs, we won't battle each other in idiotic ways. We have a single monetary union at the end of the line, at least. Which means that we will not intervene in our exchange rates, we will keep the competitiveness where we found it. Or else we will be forced into what has been going on at the periphery in most of your states. which is a slow, painful reduction in standards, in labor costs, improving the competitiveness, but at a huge price. At a huge price in long-term unemployment, which has its direct effects and so on, reduces potential GDP levels, in standard, and in the end, you get there, but you could have done that with the exchange rate in a few months. And you have to do this in 5 to 10 years. And that's more or less a description of what has been happening in the periphery of the European Union. And now we have fiscal pact. And we have normally functioning fiscal rules. And this means that we can't intervene there even. So if you add to this a general attempt, a more soft one, granted, towards the flexibilization of labor markets, you will see that the next spike for most of Europe, the next crisis, and it will come obviously, it's cyclical, by definition. There will be a next crisis in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we don't know. It will produce, if this remains unchanged, or if it moves towards, in the same direction we've been moving, it will produce much more horrid results, even compared to these horrible few years. So, okay, as a result of the European project, nothing really changes, say, for Austria and Germany, as far as we're talking about, fiscal policy and so on. We have an attempt, basically, of disseminating the natural institutional solutions of Austria and Germany to the rest of the Union. So an important set of elements may change in the two element countries, Ireland and the UK, in the Mediterranean countries, and in the smaller EU members from the periphery. Okay. Questions, answers, lunch. Straight to lunch? Okay.
I have a question about multipliers. Well, actually, I want to comment because I find it very interesting that both sides, well, on the one side, the Keynesians, and on the other, it's called the mainstream in the last years, they all use multipliers to find basis or just to back up their arguments. So, how do you comment on that?
Well, you remember from the beginning of the lecture, we were talking about what the relevant unit of analysis is, the ways that these models are formed. You have different presumptions, there's not just a difference between Keynesians and new classical, you have also a difference between old Keynesian and new Keynesian economies. It's a completely different thing if you acknowledge that there can be such a state as a crisis, as a continued reduction in aggregate demand. Because new classicals often assume that markets are self-correcting. There could be an exogenous shock. But markets are essentially rational. They rationally allocate scarce resources. And if there is a crisis, there are natural market forces that will lead us out. And this is one of the reasons why. So it's not so much, sometimes they even measure it differently, this is true. But it's mostly a matter of writing up a mathematical model that reflects your first assumptions. So you have huge economists like Robert Barrow that will tell you that the multipliers are small. You have Ardana, Lessina, that whole thing with expansionary austerity. You increase austerity measures, you slash your spending, and magically the GDP will rise as an effect of this, because there will be an improvement in investor confidence, and there will be numerous effects and so on. And they get the normal model. And Robert Barrow even measured some of them. And, you can see that they actually think that they're looking at something that reflects expansionary austerity idea. And Keynesians like Krugman will tell you, of course, that this, or Blanchard will tell you that this is an illness. Anything more? Yeah.
You may have discussed this and I missed it, but one of your first graphs was the U, where the countries that perform the best are on either side, the LME or the CME.
Sorry, go on. This is?
Yeah. What's the reason why there's less performance in the middle?
Sorry, what?
Why is there less performance in the middle?
Okay, so this reflects the general idea of varieties of capitalism, of course. This is the most basic insight that you can have in varieties of capitalism. The countries that group towards these ideal types, LME and CME ideal types, will have a larger GDP growth, will be more effective. And the countries which tend to mix liberal with coordinated regimes in industrial relations, in the way that capital markets function, in the way educational system functions even, will be somewhere in the middle. So this is supposed to be France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Turkey, So it's obviously not always true. And you have attempts at defining a third model. So it's not just LME and CME that produce these growth rates, but you have the idea of a Mediterranean model of capitalism, of a developing market model of capitalism that's supposed to reflect some of the more successful Eastern European countries, say. But that's the idea. So however you define these institutional interlocks that exploit each other's positive externality well, you will have some successful countries that do it well, and other unsuccessful countries that did it stupidly. Is that it? Okay, lunchtime.